Genesis 3 verse 22. Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. What's happening here? We first have Genesis 1:26, which basically states that God expresses the desire that I want to create mankind, has my image and my likeness. Then in chapter 2 verse 16, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may eat freely from every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And then we have this most peculiar verse in chapter 3 verse 22, and this verse comes after the event of both the man and the woman partaking of this fruit. Then this verse comes about that says, And the Lord God said, Behold, now man has become like one of us. It's precisely the humanity that has partaken of this knowledge of good and evil that is to declare to be like God. What's happening here? I'm going to give two alternative ways of understanding this text. And you don't have to choose one or the other. It's just two ways of understanding it, and there's beneficial ways in both of them. But I want to first make two contextual observations. The first observation is that the Genesis 1 from verse 1 until chapter 2 verse 4 used to be a separate story from the story that begins in chapter 2 verse 5 onwards. Scholars calls this the E source and the H source, the Elohim source and the Yahweh source. If you want to understand more about the sources, the book Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Friedman is a good introduction to the subject. But basically, what it states is that there's as many stories are repeated within the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And one of the versions, the E source, knows God as Elohim until he reveals himself as Yahweh to Moses. The other source knows God as Yahweh right from the beginning. That's just one of many differences between these two sources. But these two sources can be traced to two different kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And so they existed, these stories existed independently before they were brought together and amalgamated, edited, and joined together to make one text. Now that's useful to understand because part of the problem is that we are reading this whole text as one sequential story. If we only had Genesis 1, then obviously this verse wouldn't be a problem at all. God created man in his image and his likeness, and we'll try and work out what does that mean. If we did not have Genesis 1 and only started from Genesis 2 verse 5 onwards, we would look at this process of creation in which man becomes the image and likeness of God. And again, there wouldn't be that problem. So it seems like if we read it in a sequence, that we look at Genesis 1:26 and it seems like a singular event in which God creates man as its image and likeness. But chapters 2 and 3 is more focused on the process of how does man become the image and likeness of God. That's the first contextual observation I want to make. Then the second observation, and we spent some time with it in a previous lesson, I think it was lesson 3 or 5, where we asked whether this text has to do with the fall or the birth of humanity. the modern way in which we read this text as a historic account of the fall of humanity was never part of the ancient way of understanding this text, and still not part of much of the Jewish understanding of what this text was intended to communicate. So they do not come to the text with the question, what went wrong? Rather, they come to the text with the question, what makes us human? So that is also a very different approach to chapter 2 and 3. So now I want to give the two alternative ways of understanding Genesis 3 verse 22. What does it mean when God says, now mankind has become like one of us, knowing both good and evil? The first option open to us is to accept that it is exactly the man and woman who has partaken of the knowledge of good and evil that are like God. That's one of the most obvious ways of reading the text. And interestingly, nothing in the text actually refers to that event as sin. Nothing in the text refers to that event as a fall. And so one of the ways of reading this text is to say this is the process by which human consciousness is developed for us to be fully human. It explores the depth of what it means to be human. And it is exactly the kind of humanity that knows the difference between good and evil, that knows what it means both to love and to hate, to suffer and to experience joy. It's exactly that kind of complexity that makes us like God. So let me go into that a little bit deeper. This idea that what does it mean that we partake of this fruit of the knowledge of good and evil? Ramban, a classic 13th century scholar, had this amazing commentary on this text. And when he speaks about the knowledge of good and evil, you know, the serpent says, God knows that in the day that you eat of it. Now, that implies that I know that God knows. And if you partake of this, you will also know what I know and what God knows. And so this desire for the knowledge of good and evil, he actually interprets it as the desire for good and evil, the desire to know both love and hate, to know these extremes. Because prior to this condition, what is often seen as the ideal, amazing state of innocence is actually a very naive innocence. It's a childish innocence in which the intensity of love is not fully experienced. That's why in chapter 2, the last few verses, it speaks about the man and the woman were both naked. They were unashamed. And when it speaks about them becoming one flesh, it seems like there's no hesitation, there's no difference between the desire and the act of consummation of their desire for one another. There's just this seamless flow of unashamed unity. But that is also a naive innocence that is now being transformed as they partake of a new complexity, a new knowledge. And so he states this: they do indeed become like God, capable of free will decisions, this partaking of, I desire to have my own will, to choose either good or evil, to love or to hate. In a sense, that freedom to choose is a capacity that God has. But for human beings, however, this development is destructive, since it awakens transgressive desires. Now, I quoted that from a book called The Murmuring Deep, Aviva Zomberg. Excellent to go and study this option further. So the basic idea in this option is that the story of mankind partaking of the knowledge of good and evil, this whole story is to show the development of human consciousness from a naive innocence into a full maturity. And even the expelling out of the garden is not an image of a fall, but rather it's the image of giving birth. That's why, for instance, Adam, just after the announcement is made that, now you will labor for whatever you have, childbirth will be with pain. He's introduced into this world of greater pain, greater intensity of suffering. Yet he turns to his wife right after that and says, you will be called Eve because you are the mother of all life. It's almost like, yes, you seduced me into this condition, but this has opened up an intensity and a wealth of life that I have not experienced before. And so there's one reading of this text that suggests that it is exactly the humanity that partakes of the complexity of knowing both good and evil, of experiencing both love and hatred, of being confronted with both the joy and the pain of our existence, that births us out of our naive, childish innocence into the reality of what it means to be human, and into a condition that actually makes us more like God than what we were in that condition of naive innocence. So that's one option. The second option, and that is explored beautifully in Zando Goodhart's book, The Prophetic Law. And what he draws our attention to is that from the time where they actually, well, first of all, the woman partakes of the fruit, that she sees that it's desirable. She partakes of it, gives to her husband who is with her. And from that point onward, the text itself takes on a new sensory quality. Even God enters the story as a character that can be discerned with the senses more than before. So suddenly they can hear the sound of the Lord walking in the cool of the day. Everything becomes sensory. Now, what he suggests is rather radical, and that is that the whole text from here onwards is actually the perspective of one of these earthlings who have partaken of this knowledge and this confusion of good and evil. In other words, their perception of God is very much like any child who experiences their parents as one who both says yes and one who says no. The parent both provides and punishes. And in the same way, Adam and Eve experience God in their childlike state as a being who both provides them with clothing, yet prohibits them from other things. And so everything, even the perceived punishment, is a projection from the perspective of one of his earthlings onto God. And so it is from their perspective that they imagine God as the one who withholds his own image and likeness, a God who is jealous of the fact that they have now become like one of us. And it is for this reason that he expels them. And so what he suggests is that there never was an expulsion, that this whole process of scapegoating, of blaming God, of blaming my wife, of blaming the snake, of blaming, that is such a human response to circumstances, situations that doesn't quite go the way we want it to go, then we find somebody to blame. And so from his perspective, that whole verse can be read as a projection from and the interpretation of how they perceive God as one who withholds. So those are two interesting options. Obviously, 15, 20 minutes, you will never get a comprehensive understanding across, but I wanted to respond to some of the questions. A few of you asked me about that. And so those are some ideas to stir further thought. Thank you. Bye.